Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can set it up down there.
Okay, yeah.
You just have to make it someone refer people to it.
Right,
Otherwise, no one will know.
right.
Yeah. Probably that.
Yeah.
And, it's, I think it just, there are like 10 or 20 towns that really
Yeah.
each has to be on its.
Right. I'm trying to look and see.
Yeah. Sure, yeah, which is.
The district.
Yeah. So. Races. Yeah, well, it needs to be. Oh, yeah. Are you sure that sound works? Can you check that? Yeah, the sound works. Yeah. Oh, wait, just. Hello, Rashid.
You have to make me look stunning, right?
Absolutely. Working on do the class today. Oh, okay. So, just. Well, I did the chocolate chip. They were a little crunchy. So the people on Zoom are going to be able to notice the recipes. So even if they're actually like speaking,
I'm just wondering how you want to stop.
That's why. Initially, we went there and their part to the major role.
I love that. It's always good to hear like-minded consciousness. Yeah.
Well, in
Trying to figure out what.
Great, that was your budget.
Which one's that projecting?
My home would be my six.
Nobody's here. Yeah.
So maybe change that together. That's right, yeah.
See me what I think. Okay. Yeah.
So you want to make this one, so why don't you start by this?
No, I said Joe's.
Alright, so
Joe's.
Joe's.
Yeah. No,
Because I thought you didn't. So why don't you start by this?
No, I said.
So
Joe's.
Alright, so Joe's.
Gallery. Yeah. Interdisciplinary.
Oh, wait, no, we don't want to go through, we're gonna be projecting like double. Well, yeah, but I mean, we're not gonna be.
Oh, this black.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think for the. So if you put this, we're sit down. Try that.
And Rashid
Hi.
is.
Okay, how about you?
Okay.
I haven't seen that for a while. Yeah.
Yes. You see what this is about? Yeah. There she is. So as to the majority involved. Yeah.
All those.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's not very signed up virtually.
Oh, I see. Okay. So there's that.
That's all on the third quarter.
Right. So
36 participants. That counts the two cameras that are here.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this better? Can you hear me now? Somebody can hear me in the back. How's this? Yeah, okay, good. Before we start, I'll just let everybody know that the bathrooms go past our lunchroom and then around the corner, and you'll see the bathrooms right there. If anybody would like to know that.
Rosemary, there's so much echoing. Is there a way to
Really?
change that?
We're having a little difficulty, too much echo here. Hold it farther away. A mic stand, don't see one. How about if I hold it about here? Is that better? No. How is this? Testing? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay.
Speak a bit louder.
Yes, I can. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rosemary Keene. I'm the board co-chair with Jonathan King of Massachusetts Peace Action. And we're really happy to see you all here this afternoon, and also to see all of our attenders on Zoom. Put us all together, and we have a good-sized group. The theme of our meeting today is Ceasefire Now, Fascism, Liberalism, and the Assault on Gaza. Many of us are grieving, and some of us are in deep grief at the loss of life and horrific suffering caused and enabled by our country's foreign policy. We are also in deep resistance to this policy. We are here in solidarity with all people working for peace and justice. We're very happy, as I already said, that you all are here, and we're happy to be holding this meeting at Roxbury Community College for the first time. Our program for this afternoon is to hear from our speakers, Phyllis Bennis, Michelle Mushabek, and Hayat Imam. We'll have about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussions after we hear from them. Remember your questions, because you will get a chance to ask them. Following this, at about 2:15, Paul Shannon and Brian Garvey will lead us through our program review. And at about 3, we'll break up into 4 small groups. Each one will examine a different critical issue for the peace movement in 2024. These small groups will be led by Hayat, Jonathan, Cole Harrison, our executive director, and I believe Paul Shannon. At about 4 p.m., we'll have a short business meeting to elect our board and hear from our new board candidates. We're very delighted today to have as our keynote speaker, Phyllis Bennis, whose remarks are titled Gaza, Genocide, Occupation, and U.S. Politics. Bennis is an activist scholar who directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. militarism, and UN issues. She's also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and more recently spent 6 years on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, where she now serves as its international advisor. Yes, let's hear it for Jewish Voice for Peace. Phyllis works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the U.S. and around the world. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. She's edited and written 11 books. Among her latest is the 7th update edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, published in 2018. Michelle Mushabek will then respond to Phyllis's remarks. Mr. Mushabek is a Palestinian-American writer, editor, translator, and musician whose parents were forced into exile from their home in West Jerusalem in 1948. He is the founder of the independent publishing house Interlink Publishing and has authored several books, including A Brief Introduction to Arabic Music. He has performed as a percussionist on concert hall stages worldwide. The mission of Interlink Publishing is to introduce Western readers to Arab writers and to change the way people think about the world. And we have quite a few books in the back for you to look at and think about. Following his talk and before our question and discussion time, we'll hear from our own Hayat Imam. Hayat is an American Muslim of Bangladeshi origin who's committed to building global social justice movements. She cut her teeth in the anti-nuclear movement of the late 70s before spending 10 years internationally in the field of women's development. Hayat is a former director of the Boston Women's Fund and former board chair of Grassroots International. She's presently active with Dorchester People for Peace and a member of the board at Massachusetts Peace Action. Hayat will address the new McCarthyism and how Muslims right now today are experiencing McCarthyism. And finally, following Hayat's remarks, we'll have about 20 minutes for our questions. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Phyllis Bennis. I did. There's a better way.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work that you do. Thanks to MAPA for the invitation to be here, for bringing you all here. And thanks to everybody in Massachusetts who voted no preference. This is great. Yeah, And is there
We gotta move the podium to get
Good.
rid of that.
and is there
Ooh, maybe the other side would be better.
is there by chance a mic stand?
Yes. How about that?
Okay. You know what happens when you get old and have to put on your glasses in between looking up and down. Anyway, thank you all for the work that you do, for the work that you will do. You know, the no preference thing and all of its predecessors in Michigan, in Minnesota, in all these places, voting uncommitted. It's so important. It's using the vote. It's using the democratic processes, not just for elections, but to save lives. What better use of the vote or the not vote than to save lives? So this becomes crucial because it's not about who we're voting for. It's about changing the policies and using the vote for exactly that. You know, some of you, I recognize a lot of you. I've seen you before, you've seen me before, you've probably heard me before. And you know that one of the things I tend to say a lot is that how we understand history has a lot to do with when you start the clock or when you don't start the clock. So what we're dealing with today is a global crisis that has put Palestine on the central map of the world in a way that in the modern era, which I of course mean my life, has never been the case. And part of it is because people think something started on October 7th. You know, the war started on October 7th. The crisis started on October 7th. The killing started on October 7th. Hamas started it on October 7th. And each of those, you want to shake them and say, wait, that's not true. Before October 7th, there was a whole history. We could start the clock 75 years ago with what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, which was the expulsion, the dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in what is now considered southern Israel. We could start it 55 years ago at the time, 55 years of occupation after 75 years of apartheid, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem that jointly gave Israel control of all the land from the river to the sea, what it maintains today. It may not like that slogan, but they sure do like that control. Or we could look at 17 years of the siege of Gaza. You know, I've known about the siege of Gaza. I've been in Gaza since the siege began. And I thought I knew the bare bones, at least, of what a siege looked like. But it turned out I had no idea. I had no idea. Hello. I still had no idea.
You should be good, just make sure it's not clear.
I'm speaking clearly into it, but it's not liking.
The other one.
Am I?
They're the same.
Pretty fancy looking. How's
Yeah.
this one? Okay. Somebody up there likes me. Most of them don't. You know, one of the things I learned about the earlier siege in Gaza, the siege that began not on October 7th, when this extreme siege began, but the regular, normal siege began in 2007. One of the things that I found out was that in the course of that siege, 20% of children in Gaza were stunted by the age of 2. Not because they were starving, there was food. There just wasn't good food. It wasn't allowed in. So they didn't have enough protein. They didn't have fresh vegetables. And the children are paying a price, a whole generation of children in Gaza. Now, we have a whole generation of people and children and babies who are dying of famine directly on our watch with our tax money and with weapons provided and cheered by our governments. And that's been true in the latest period of time, 17 years of siege and now 6 months of genocide. This is not a new issue for peace action, not for MAPA. You all have worked on the issue of Palestine for a long time. But historically, the issue was marginalized. It was marginalized even within the broader peace movement until about 25 years ago. It's always been marginalized in mainstream political discourse. And it's been absolutely anathema for policy discourse. You know, we always thought, for me working on this issue from back in the 70s until now, we always thought no one ever lost an election by being too pro-Israel. Well, Joe Biden might be the first. And I think that what we're looking at with this history, we know of the Nakba, the primary identification of Palestinian tragedy and resistance and resilience, what happened in 1947 and 48, is happening again in Gaza at twice the level, twice the number of people have already been dispossessed, lost their homes, once, twice, 3 times. And keep in mind that the population of Gaza was already 70% refugees, overwhelmingly from those who were expelled from southern Israel, what is now southern Israel. That was the first time, and they ended up in Gaza. Now, those who were in northern Gaza were expelled forcibly to first central Gaza, and then from there forced out again to southern Gaza, now to Rafah, where 1.5 million people are crammed into this tiny little town. Who here has been to Rafah? You, couple people? It's a really little town that before all of this had a population of about just over 200,000 people, about 230,000 people. Now it has 1.5 million with no shelter, let alone no water, no electricity, no food, but not even protection from the rain. And that kind of displacement, that kind of drastic emergency is what we're now facing on this massive scale in Gaza. The Israeli response after October 7th was very much like the US response to 9/11. It was talked about at the time, but then we sort of dropped it. You know, that analogy was left out. You know, their response was based on vengeance, not justice. Just as our response to 9/11 was based on vengeance, not justice. And in that context, one of the things that we have to look at is that this, like the US wars in Afghanistan and later in Iraq, were not wars against a military force or a regime. It was a war against an entire people. The entire people of Afghanistan were the victims of a war in wreaking vengeance for an act that was carried out by 19 people, none of whom were Afghans, none of whom lived in Afghanistan or had ever been to Afghanistan. And yet the people of Afghanistan to this day are suffering the consequences. The same is being true in Gaza. For an action, some of which was illegal, some of which we should recognize was not, but much of which was illegal. The attacks on civilians was certainly illegal under all international law. Taking hostages under international law, clearly illegal. And the responsibility for that was done by some small number of armed people, led by Hamas, but with others that nobody even knows who they are. And the people paying the price are 2.3 million people in Gaza, because this is not a war against Hamas. This is a war against the people of Gaza, all of them. And in that context, it looks very much like the legacy of the Indian wars in our country, where the idea was kill them all because they will grow up and try and kill us. The famous massacre at Sand Creek that some of you may remember from Native history, where the soldiers, led by a Colonel John Chivington, who happened to be a Methodist minister, I always found that a bit ironic, ordered his troops to attack this peaceful village on the shores of a river. And some of his own soldiers came back and said, "We can't do that. It's people, it's children, it's women, they're sleeping. It's a peaceful village." And his answer was, "Kill them all. Nits make lice. Kill them all." That was the words of Colonel Chivington. This is the words of the Israeli military. Kill them all because they will grow up to attack us. And that's one of the reasons that we look at this recognition of genocide now. This is not just about occupation. This is not just about apartheid. Apartheid shapes it. But genocide is something different. You know, international law, who are the lawyers here? Any lawyers? All right, just one or two. So for everybody else, international law is like, what? It is really complicated. It is a whole language of its own. You read it and say, what did I just read? I have no idea. But unlike that, the definition of genocide and the Genocide Convention is actually very straightforward. It's rather short and it's very clear. To qualify to be genocide, you know, assuming people want to qualify in that way, two things need to be present. It's not just killing a lot of people. In fact, you don't actually have to kill anybody to have it qualify as genocide. Two things have to be present. Number one, there has to be a specific intent to destroy all or part of a group. Now, you can do that by killing them all, or killing some of them for the part of the group, but you don't have to kill them. Because the definition of genocide has 5 possibilities of what it can mean. Number 1 is killing members of the group. Number 2 is injuring members of the group. Number 3 is creating conditions so that the group cannot survive as a group. That can mean being forced out of their historic lands. Sound familiar, anybody? It can mean a host of things. Number 4 is preventing births in the group. And number 5 is transferring babies or children out of the group. Any of those actions qualify as genocide if there is a specific intent to destroy all or part of a group. So there can be a war where all or part of a group gets destroyed. And that could be, one could imagine, that it was not the intention. The intention was to go after a certain army. That's not the case here. And we know that because the Israeli leadership has told us their intentions. And they began telling us on October 7th, when they said what were their specific intents. And this goes from the president to the prime minister, to the minister of defense, to other members of the cabinet, to random members of the Knesset, to military leaders. They all said it. So one of them said, there are no civilians there. We have to kill them all. Somebody else said, we have to erase Gaza. More recently, one of them said, we should use a nuclear bomb. It should be like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One of the others said that these are human animals and we will treat them as such. One of them said, we need a second Nakba. Somebody else said, this is the Gaza Nakba, said with praise. If that's not specific intent to destroy all or some of the group, I don't know what could be clearer. It was on that basis that South Africa, with its own history of apartheid, which has recognized as a government, as South African ordinary people for generations, including the greats of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, have always recognized that the treatment of Palestinians under Israeli military occupation is that of apartheid. It took, and Palestinians, of course, recognized it the same way. It took 20 years to normalize that recognition, right? And it only happened starting about 3 or 4 years ago, when major international and Israeli human rights organizations, from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to B'Tselem to Yesh Din, all of them began issuing major, thorough reports, 200-300 pages long, documenting what did it mean to say this was apartheid. That's when it started becoming a normal part of our discourse. It has taken about 20 weeks to normalize the discourse about genocide. Doesn't mean that everybody recognizes it. Certainly in Congress, they don't. Certainly in the White House, they don't. But this is now part of the normal discourse in talking about Israeli treatment of Palestinians. So in the Convention Against Genocide, which documents both the definition, but it does something else. Unlike all other parts of international law, it says that not only is it illegal to do these things, to commit genocide, to cheer on genocide, but it holds obligations for all of the signatories to the convention. There's 153 countries have signed the Genocide Convention, are parties to the Genocide Convention, including, of course, Israel, and of course, the United States, are longtime signatories to the Genocide Convention. It puts obligations on all of the signatories to do whatever is in their power to prevent a genocide if it's looming and to stop it if it happens. So what is our government doing? Are we stopping it? Are we preventing it? No, we're cheerleading for it and we're arming it and we're paying for it with our tax money. And I think that's a very critical factor. It was all of that that led, this is really very awkward here, that's what led the South African government to take the extraordinary initiative that they did at the International Court of Justice to bring charges against Israel. So this is a case between two sovereign countries. This is not involving the Palestinians as a party. This is a suit brought by South Africa against the state of Israel. And after their generations of apartheid on their own right, they know about this. And they were before this, before October, South Africa was already leading the way at the United Nations to, among other things, reopen the committee, the special committee against apartheid at the UN to help build the global anti-apartheid movement. That was already underway. And so in December, they brought this charge of genocide. And in January, and they had that amazing, I don't know how many of you had the chance to watch it online. It's the most extraordinary thing you'll ever see. A 3-hour disposition by the dream team of South African lawyers explaining exactly what has happened in Gaza at that time, the last, I guess it was 3.5 months. And the court ruled in January, and it said that, yes, it is plausible that the Israeli actions are indeed genocidal. It's not a final ruling. That usually takes 2 to 3 years. This was not hearings where you had witnesses and cross-examination and all of that. This was the South Africans presenting in 3 incredible hours their analysis. And the Israelis the next day got 3 hours to say, oh, it really wasn't genocide at all. It wasn't, we didn't intend to have any of that believed. We just said those things, but it wasn't because we believed that. So the court found that it was indeed plausibly genocide. And as a result, they imposed 6 provisional measures on Israel to carry out. I won't go through them all. We can talk about it in questions. Suffice it to say that they didn't explicitly say there has to be an immediate ceasefire, but they did say that Israel needs to provide all necessary measures to prevent any of those 5 things I told you constitute genocide. And the second was they had to make sure that their military did not commit any of those actions. So right there, that's pretty much saying you can't keep killing people. Israel has not abided by any of them. Since that ruling at the end of January, 7,093 more Palestinians have been killed. Since October 7th, 33,547 that we know of have been killed. There are somewhere between 4,000 and 20,000 people missing under the rubble of the buildings Israel has bombed. 14,500 children have been killed, 200 humanitarian aid workers, 105 journalists. In each of those categories, this level of death and destruction is worse than any other war since the record keeping began. That's what we are dealing with today. And the US is complicit. It's complicit not only because it's in violation of international law and the Convention Against Genocide, but its own legal obligations. From the Foreign Assistance Act, the Arms Export Control Act, the US War Crimes Act, the Leahy Law, the Genocide Convention Implementation Act, and President Biden's own National Security Memorandum 20, all of them, I'm not going to go through all what each of them says, but they all prohibit providing weapons to a government or a military that is committing human rights violations. Does anybody really want to contest that there are human rights violations going on? So for these months, the administration has, come on, stay there, refused to call for a ceasefire. That's why the issues around the United Nations have been so clear about US intentions, refusing to acknowledge the need for a ceasefire. The US has a whole long history of this. It goes back to 2006, when the UN tries to call for a ceasefire and the US vetoes and says, no, we don't need a ceasefire yet. Not enough people are dead yet. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, if we look at the official DC responses to all this, what does the timeline look like? October 7th, we stand by Israel, unconditional support. Hamas are monsters and they are fully responsible. There is no history before October 7th. We will ignore any protest because clearly it's not serious and it'll go away. By November, well, maybe the protests are a little bit more serious than we thought. We need to respond. So what do we do first? We escalate the attacks of false claims of anti-Semitism to discredit anyone who says, perhaps the origins of this do not begin on October 7th, but begin in 75 years of occupation and apartheid and colonialism. Anyone who says that is ipso facto an anti-Semite. So that's December, and then we get the South African charges being fought out at the International Court of Justice, and the US answers that by saying it is meritless, it is without merit. January, the ICJ issues its ruling. The US response within hours of that ruling is to announce they are cutting all aid to UNRWA, the most important by far humanitarian aid agency working in Gaza, and the only international agency whose mandate includes defense of the Palestinian right of return. So if UNRWA disappears, which is clearly the goal of the Netanyahu administration, it's not only to deny food and water and education and shelter and all of the things that UNRWA supplies. It is also to make sure that there is no international agency charged with defending the right to return, something that is built into the very fabric of international law and has never been either acknowledged or implemented by Israel. So all of this goes on. In February, we have the first of the uncommitted. We have Michigan with this amazing 100,000 plus people voting uncommitted because they are not prepared to vote for someone who is endorsing and paying for and arming a genocide. In March, the US finally allows a ceasefire resolution to go forward, but it's with weasel words, and it's not going to be implemented, although it is enforceable. This notion that it's not enforceable, which is what the US ambassador said within moments after the vote, a complete and utter lie. Article 25 of the UN Charter says very clearly, every member of the UN is obligated to abide by rulings of the Security Council, which we usually don't like. But in this case, really, this is when you're going to say we're not obligated. And then in March, by the end of March, you have the Schumer position, the Schumer statement. Wow, right? Going out directly against Netanyahu. And boy, is that legitimate, and is that needed, and is it dangerous? Now, why is it dangerous? Because this isn't just about Netanyahu. Netanyahu is doing this for personal reasons, because as soon as this war is over, and he's no longer the prime minister, which he won't be because now everybody hates him, they don't hate this war. The war will continue. He will go to jail, but the war will continue. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, I'm going to move forward a little more quickly than I had intended and talk about our response, because at the end of the day, that's why we're here, not just to hear what they do. We know what they do. What can we do? We have seen through this 6 months the biggest protests ever on this issue, ever in history. And this was not something that just was immediately sparked by October 7th. For the young people, this issue, the issue of Palestinian rights, is not some moral foreign issue that people are sort of taking up out of the goodness of their heart or something to take care of poor people somewhere else. This is an issue of justice. And in 2020, when the streets of the cities of this country erupted with the George Floyd protests, that's when the issue of Palestine came right onto the center of the agenda for the justice generation. Palestine is seen as a racial justice, a social justice issue, comparable to the South African anti-apartheid movement. So all of these groups, Rabbis for Ceasefire, the Muslim organizations, the students who walked out, the occupations of every famous place you could imagine, the cities passing ceasefire resolutions, cities for ceasefire, the voter things that started in Michigan but are still going on. All of this is unprecedented. The internal opposition that's coming from within the State Department with the resignations, within USAID, 1,000 people signed a note saying, we can't accept this policy. Biden's own staff of the Biden-Harris campaign committee, the campaign headquarters in wherever they are, I guess they're in Delaware, came out and said, Mr. President, we can't do our job. We can't get you reelected with this policy. So the question then is, what's the question for us? Too many people right now are asking the question, well, how do we get people to say that they'll vote for Biden because the alternative is fascism? That's the wrong question. The question is, how do we get Biden to change his policy? And I say his policy because this is very much a single person policy. It has the support of imperialist policy that goes back generations. That's certainly true. But the particularity of it and the willingness to even accept and arm and fund acknowledged genocide is not what traditional pragmatic imperialism has always been willing to do. This is different. So we need to build the broadest kind of movement that we can. Not only is this no longer marginal, but the people who are coming out for this movement are people who have never come out for any foreign policy issues. Many of them never been at a protest ever before. Why? Some of it is because the absolute viciousness and horror that people are seeing on their screens every day. And part of it is because of those screens, because of social media, we have access to more of it than ever before. You have to try incredibly hard to avoid minute by minute coverage of the worst atrocities most of us have ever seen close up. So what does that mean? This is not just about the election. It means that our work in whether it's voting uncommitted or something else, it means that we are responsible for changing the policy. Changing the policy. That's why we have to vote uncommitted, to make sure that the pressure gets magnified so that the pressure is, we up the game of bringing pressure to bear, certainly on Congress, because they can force some of it to happen. But ultimately, this is going to be made in the White House. And if people around the president are not telling him that, Mr. President, this is more serious than ever before. This is not a situation where people are going to say, well, yeah, we made our point, but now, we're going to have to come home to your party because it's not like that. Genocide is different. Genocide is not a policy disagreement. Genocide is mass murder. And that's what we're looking at. In this year, Massachusetts is going to send $129,975,000 directly to the Israeli military. $129,975,320. You want that? You want your money to go there? It could also fund, that same amount of money could fund 45,000 kids getting health care. It could fund 15,450 families finding a place in public housing. Or 3,439 students could get their debt canceled. What will make us safer? Ask it that way. You don't even have to ask from the moral vantage point, but we do have to also hold up the moral vantage point. That is also our job. So when we look at these changes in Congress, they are extraordinary. Chris Van Hollen coming out saying, we need to stop sending weapons. I mean, this is unprecedented. All this stuff is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. Those of you who have been working on this issue for a long time, I've been working on it for way too long. Michelle's been working on it for a lifetime. None of us have ever seen anything like this, these changes. And yet, because of the commitment of this White House, it's not enough. We have to do more. It means being more creative, more consistent, figuring out ways to bring more pressure to bear so that the question doesn't get raised, how do we get people to vote for the person which at this moment is unthinkable? But how do we get that unthinkable person to start thinking and to start feeling and to start changing his position? Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis, for this inspiring speech. Thank you, Phyllis, for this inspiring speech. I too need glasses. First, I would like to thank you all at MAPA for all that you do. I salute you and celebrate your bold, daring, irrepressible spirit as you advocate for an immediate ceasefire, an end to Israeli occupation, an end to the inhumane siege of Gaza, and freedom and equality for all from the river to the sea. In times of unbearable pain, such as these, I take heart in knowing that there are people like you who are doing the important work that is needed more than ever before. I am honored to be part of you and with you here today. And thank you, Cole, and thank you, Mary, for inviting me to say a few words. My close friend and collaborator, Phyllis Bennis, is, as many of you know, is the most insightful analyst when it comes to Middle East affairs and Palestine, Israel, and US foreign policy. We have known each other for, dare I say, nearly 4 decades.
I had to say it.
And we have worked very closely together. Phyllis even had a short stint at Interlink Publishing as an editor in the 80s. And we published her very first book called From Stones to Statehood about the first intifada, and went on to publish all her other books, including 2 titles that we co-wrote together or co-edited together. So Phyllis and I see things eye to eye. I agree wholeheartedly with her assessment of the situation in Gaza and in Israel-Palestine. But I'm here to add perhaps a Palestinian perspective to what was said. If you were to meet me in a bar and you would ask me to tell you about my family's stories in a sentence, I would say exile and starting over, exile and starting over, exile and starting over. I will add a clarification that I did not repeat myself 3 times because I had too many beers. For my family was displaced on multiple times, first from West Jerusalem, from Katamon, to East Jerusalem, from East Jerusalem to Jordan, from Jordan to Beirut, Lebanon, back to Jordan, and then where I ended up in the United States. But our stories will live on, and our memories of our beautiful home in Jerusalem also will live on, and we tell our stories so that our children will tell them to their children and their children's children. And in my case, my middle daughter, Hannah, recently wrote a best-selling book called Homeland, My Father Dreams of Palestine, that retells a story that I used to tell my 3 girls when they were little. So, during the Nakba of 1948, my family was terrorized. They were displaced from their home in West Jerusalem and became refugees in countries that did not want them. I carry their pain with me to this day as I raise my voice in support of Palestinian rights. It is devastating to witness yet even a larger Nakba in Gaza. The despicable, abhorrent, and unjustifiable killing of innocent civilians is unfathomable. My thoughts are with Gaza and Palestine with every breath and every heartbeat. The past 6 months have been unbearable. My partner caught me crying more than once. I cried over the death and destruction and utter disregard of human life. I cried over the staggering number of women and children massacred. I cried over pregnant mothers not having C-sections without anesthesia, and the countless fathers searching for their families under the rubble. I cried over grandparents who are witnessing yet another Nakba in their lifetime. And I also cried over the loss of many friends, writers, artists, journalists, people I worked with. The sheer cruelty of Gaza's forced intentional starvation and Israel's blocking hundreds of trucks of food and aid from reaching the people is unspeakable. As Phyllis mentioned, we continue to count, and I'm going to count yet again. It is day 183. It is now the 7th month. The death toll has surpassed 33,000, with 14,500 of these being children. Over 76,000 are injured, 203 humanitarian aid workers have been killed, 173 healthcare workers have been killed, 103 journalists have been killed, 346 schools have been destroyed, all 12 universities in Gaza have been destroyed, 24 out of 36 hospitals have been destroyed, 23 children have died from starvation. And the most important is, you know how long it takes to get humanitarian aid to the people in Rafah? 10 minutes. 10 minutes from the border crossing to where the Palestinians are now camped and starving in Rafah. What we are unable to count are the hourly lies belched out by the US government in defense of Israel. The shocking amount of weapons being sent by the US to Israel, the depth of the silence from Western media, Western academia, Western writers, artists, and scholars, and Western cultural institutions, and the profound and the staggering amount of Islamophobia that allows for this unchecked genocidal slaughter to continue. Israel does not want people to learn the truth. That is why it has not allowed foreign journalists into Gaza, and this is why this past week it passed a law banning Al Jazeera, the most trusted source, from reporting from Israel. Their story is the story of dehumanization and of the normalization of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel is a nuclear-armed regional power whose politics has been shaped by ethnic cleansing, occupation of Palestinian lands, and apartheid, according to the most major human rights organizations, as Phyllis said. So let us sum up what's happening in Palestine today. Israel was born of British colonialism. It was created through Zionist terrorism that displaced Palestinians and dispossessed them from their homes and land. It is supported financially, militarily, and diplomatically by Western, primarily US, imperialism serving war profiteers. And it is sustained by a combination of state terrorism and a system of apartheid that denies Palestinians, who, by the way, form half of the people in the territory under the control of the Israeli government from the river to the sea. half the population are denied rights. In short, Zionism is a secular colonial ideology and political system that privileges one people over another and strives to ethnically cleanse and erase Palestinians from the Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. This is the end game of 76 years of terror and ethnic cleansing. It did not start on October 7th, as Phyllis said, and it is not about Hamas. We are asked repeatedly to condemn Hamas by reporters and anchors who have been silent and asleep during much of our decades-long struggle against the brutal occupation and system of apartheid that denied our rights. Hamas is a resistance movement that was started in 1987 because of the desperate conditions Palestinians have endured since the establishment of the State of Israel. Over 50,000 Palestinians were killed between 1947 and 1987, and that was before Hamas was established. 50,000 Palestinians. Netanyahu and his extremist allies are using the pretext of the October 7th Hamas to fundamentally reshape Gaza and emptying it of Palestinians. That's the end game. And then they will move on to the West Bank and East Jerusalem as we see intensified attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem by soldiers and by armed settlers. Racism is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The director of B'Tselem, Israel's oldest human rights organization, said it very clearly. It is apartheid. It is a colonial project that employs oppression, violence, persecution, checkpoints, house demolitions, displacement, expulsion, imprisonment, land theft, torture of children, and collective punishment to ethnically cleanse non-Jewish inhabitants. It is not complicated. It is not an age-old religious feud. It is not a conflict by extremists on both sides. But despite years of this mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, and erasure, Palestinians' connection to the land of Palestine is stronger than ever before. It is a link to our identity, to our indigenous traditions and culture. From the river to the sea, under occupation, in refugee camps, in the diaspora, and around the world, Palestinians are people who have been facing the brutal injustice of apartheid for 76 years. I could have never imagined in my wildest nightmares the horrors we are witnessing in Gaza, in Palestine, and the complicity and active participation of the United States in the genocide of my people. Is the strongest, most powerful country in history really too weak to open a gate to let humanitarian aid into Gaza? Or is it complicit in Israel's use of starvation as a weapon of war? The destruction of Gaza and the genocide of Palestinians, as Phyllis said, will be a huge part of Biden's legacy. The Biden administration has been unwilling to apply necessary pressure on Netanyahu's government to stop the killing of civilians and access to humanitarian aid, but rather has transferred more weapons, often sidestepping Congress to do so, and used its veto power at the United Nations 3 times to shield Israel from resolutions in support of a ceasefire. Biden has not been able to enforce the United States' own laws that were mentioned earlier by Phyllis. As we see it right now, Congress has become an arms dealership. We have no money for education, no money for healthcare, no money for student debt relief, and yet we can fund your wars. The unimaginable suffering being inflicted every minute of every day on the Palestinian people of Gaza, including in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is too painful to bear. It must come to an end. The children of Gaza are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. We cannot let Gaza alone in sacrifice. Our words are hope. Our ability to raise voices, our voices in protest is hope. Our actions, whether it be by calling the White House or elected officials or marching in the streets, our actions are hope. We are experiencing a McCarthy-era speech suppression and intimidation, especially on university campuses, and I am really in awe of all the younger generation, the students. I see it in my own town. 57 students at UMass Amherst were put in jail. As I speak today, 50 students are occupying the Smith College Administration building right now, demanding divestment from weapons manufacturers by the college. Columbia University only yesterday suspended a student for Palestinian activism. Gaza is the defining moral issue of our time. We are outraged because we are human. How many years of suffocating siege it has endured, how many brutal invasions it has confronted, how many martyrs it has sacrificed, how many children it left parentless, and how many it robbed of their mothers. How many have lost their homes, their farms, their orchards, their olive trees, their livelihood. An injustice that left people in a crowded tent encampments without food, water, electricity, or adequate health care. A devastation not seen in our lifetime, and cruelty unmatched. But as the celebrated Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish said in a 1973 poem, he wrote this poem in 1973, he said about Gaza, it's called Silence of Gaza. He said, the beauty of Gaza is that our voices do not reach it. Nothing distracts it. Nothing takes its fist from the enemy's face. Gaza is devoted to rejection, hunger and rejection, thirst and rejection, displacement and rejection, torture and rejection, siege and rejection, death and rejection. These are the words of Mahmoud Darwish that he wrote, he penned 50 years ago. They gave voice to the pain of Palestinians, but are most poignant now than ever, as Gaza is devastated by more than 6 months of brutal Israeli onslaught. For us Palestinians, words are often the only weapon we have available to fight. I'm also going to end with another piece of a poem by Mahmoud Darwish. He said, on this earth, there is what makes life worthwhile. On this earth is the Lady of Earth, the mother of all beginnings, the mother of all endings. Her name was Palestine. Her name became Palestine. My lady, because you are my lady, I deserve life. And as he wrote in a later poem called The War Will End. He said, the war will end. The leaders will shake hands. The old woman will keep waiting for her martyred son. The girl will wait for her beloved husband. And those children will wait for their heroic father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to all of you. Phyllis and Michelle, your messages are so important to us. They are resonating in my mind and my heart because they were enlightened by your minds and your hearts. You provided us a strong blueprint on moving forward and the inspiration to keep doing the work that we're doing. Thank you so much. I want to express my appreciation to the executive committee also of the Mass Peace Action Board, of which I'm a part. When I spoke of my concerns with them some days ago, they backed me up fully, and they encouraged me to share these words with the membership of MAPA today. So I'm glad of this opportunity to be here to speak to you, and also to get the feedback and wisdom from you, as well as from our excellent speakers, I hope. As a Muslim American, I'm very worried about the deep losses to our civil rights that I can see coming for all of us, but particularly for the Muslim community. Just as in the post-9/11 period, which I lived through, we are again facing the prospect of becoming suspects just for being Muslims. This time, the accusation is going to be that we are anti-Semitic. Every Muslim will be now required to prove that we are not anti-Semitic. And let's be clear, Zionists consider any pro-Palestinian solidarity, any criticisms of Israel to be anti-Semitic. In fact, the charge of anti-Semitism against Muslims is actually absurd. Muslims hold the Jewish prophets in the highest esteem, and we see them as our initial guides to God. We see Jews as our sisters, as our brothers. Historically, there were no pogroms in Muslim countries. That is a European thing. On the contrary, Jewish scholars rose to the highest levels of Muslim governance, and for centuries, Jews and Muslims lived peacefully, side by side, sharing language, sharing culture, sharing food. We all know there is an extremely well-funded Israeli lobby in the US actively working to stifle criticism of Israeli policies and to suppress Palestinian rights. And we have already seen the power of this Israeli network on university campuses. In response to passionate protests against the Israeli genocide in Gaza, we have seen the attacks of university administrations on free speech. Everyone who expressed Palestinian solidarity has been affected, not only Muslims. But in the long run, students who are Muslims, faculty who are Muslims, are going to pay an economic and social price that will be far more long-lasting and far more insidious. Muslims are in danger of being permanently blacklisted, and we are already seeing that happening in major law firms and universities. Professors have been suspended and barred at Texas Tech, Indiana University, we have seen eminent Muslim journalists silenced because they critiqued Zionism. But what is new and extremely troubling is that this is all part of an Israeli government action plan and headed up by top people in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Truth Out published a story about this plan by William I. Robinson on March 23. According to a report by the largest Israeli news website, Ynet News, the plan includes shaming and publicizing names of anyone protesting Israel's actions. The plan's goal is, and this is a quote, to inflict maximum economic consequences for all those criticizing Israel. Another direct quote says, those targeted will struggle to find employment as we will pressure employers to blacklist pro-Palestinian students. And yet another says, Israel will identify leading donors within the Jewish and Israeli community to pressure university heads to act against anti-Semitism. This, of course, is any pro-Palestinian activity on campus. We saw this scenario in action at Harvard, where wealthy donors pulled hundreds of millions of dollars from the endowment fund. So under the guise of stopping anti-Semitism, a serious form of Islamophobia is being fostered. We have been saying McCarthyism is around the corner for all of us, but it is already here for the Muslims. This wave of silencing has reached the judicial level. Joe Biden has nominated an American who's of Pakistani origin for a position on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. He's a highly qualified man, but at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that happened a couple of months ago, the questions to him were less about his qualifications, and instead he was asked questions like, do you condemn the atrocities of the Hamas terrorists? And another question was, do you think Israel is a colonial state? So now it seems we will have to take oaths of fealty to Israel in order to get on in America. Glib questions like these about complicated situations are not meant to get to know someone. They are merely attempts at entrapment. Let's keep in mind that while Muslims might be canaries in the mine, it is a matter of time before all progressives will be challenged, including the peace movement. We have already seen journalists and politicians intimidated into self-censorship. This is not surprising because, there's the fear of losing your employment, there's the fear of losing your reputations. But sadly, we're all poorer when our voices become silent. So this brings me to my second concern. How is it that a foreign country, in this case Israel, has such a huge influence on US domestic policies and US foreign policy? So much so that the snuffing out of academic freedom in the US can be orchestrated in Tel Aviv? And how is it that we can become manipulated as a nation to fund and send weapons to be used for genocide? I think we need to pay really close attention to this and to other related examples, such as AIPAC money being used to influence elections. AIPAC this year is well on the way to spending around $100 million in the upcoming elections to replace progressive members of Congress. In the normal course of things, AIPAC would be officially listed as an agent of a foreign government. But of course, we know that it is not. So I bring these troubling issues to you, and I hope that we'll have some dialogue around this later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hayat. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Phyllis. Wow, we have so much to think about. We've used up a little bit more time than we anticipated, but we do have time for a few questions. Yes, it was very worth it, wasn't it, Peter? Yes. A question in the back?
I don't know, can you hear me okay? Yep.
Actually, yes.
I mean, I really appreciate it very much, and I of course agree completely on the 76-year history.
I'll be your mic runner with
I do think one thing we don't talk about, though, you do talk about Biden critically, I appreciate that, but we don't talk about his role in the October 7th action that happened, why he played a role in that.
Which is part of this new Cold War that Biden seems to be committed to, involved China. And China introduced itself into the Middle East. It had the temerity to introduce itself into the Middle East to come and broker peace in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That outraged Joe Biden and his advisors and the American establishment. And so they came forward and pushed an alliance with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. Now, that was a military alliance, not a peace initiative. And that, if that had gone through the way it looked like it was going through, it would have put the Palestinian cause very much on the back burner, even in the Arab world. And so I think Hamas did a desperate action to reignite people's awareness of their plight, whether we think of the action itself. And I see Biden's role in that. You know, Thomas Friedman, the columnist in the New York Times, has said that is the Biden doctrine, to build an alliance between Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel, and against Iran and its proxies. That is a very dangerous concept, and is a new concept that I think led directly to October 7th. So I'm curious what you think about that, because that puts a very different light on our role in the country in what has happened in the past 6 months.
Thanks for your question. This position of the United States, which you're right about, wanting to create a coalition, an anti-Iran coalition led by primarily the US, Israel, and Saudi, with others, is not new. And it happened way before the Chinese initiative. It was actually there was a lot of emphasis on it in the Trump years. It was very much a feature of the Trump and Jared Kushner policy of how to deal with the Middle East. So this was already a long-standing reality. The question of timing, I don't think any of us have any idea what the thinking was of the people who led the attack of October 7th. Other people joined it when the walls surrounding this open-air prison, which is the Gaza Strip and had been for 17 years. You have a whole generation of people among those 2.3 million who had never been outside the Gaza Strip, this tiny little piece of land, because they are walled in. It is a siege and has been. I don't think we know what the timing of that was based on. I think it came out of desperation. The timing, I don't know whether there was any connection, but I do think it's important to recognize that this is a long-standing position of the US, and it actually had much more centrality to the policy of Trump. Like other Trump policies, Biden opposed them while he was a candidate and opposed them when he was elected, and then allowed them to remain. So that's everything from the extremist actions that Trump took when he went to Israel in 2018, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, declaring that the Israeli effort to annex the Syrian Golan Heights was now recognized by the US, that settlements were now legal. That's the only one that's been challenged, and that was only about a month ago, that Lincoln said that the settlements are not, that go back to the obstacle to peace formulation. But I don't think we can say that it was a direct action that was in response to the Chinese initiative. Certainly that wasn't something the US wanted to see, but I don't think we can say that that's correct directly to October 7th.
Yeah, I also tend to agree with Phyllis, and I think the Hamas action must have been in the planning for actually years, for a long time. They've been under siege in Gaza for 17 years. And I always ask the question when people, especially I've been giving a lot of interviews to journalists recently, and the first thing they ask me is, do you condemn Hamas? And then I would turn this question around and I would say, what would you do? What would you do when you are displaced from your home, your land is taken away, and you are put in a prison whereby you have you're not allowed to move. Your livelihood is completely gone. You can't provide food for your children. You have no hope for the future. What would you do in a situation like this when you are under siege for so long? You would, of course, try and break out of this prison in any way you can. But I think with Hamas, it's been in the planning for quite some time, and I don't think it has really a relationship to what was going on. But I also, by the same token, I think Biden has a 45-year career as a staunch Zionist and supporter of Israel, which he would have done exactly what he did on October 7th, I think.
Peter, you have a question?
And this is very difficult. Well, I'm naive enough to believe that Joe Biden is basically moral. Happens to be in the same place that I am Catholic. And I see him making a lot of moral decisions. We're compassionate about it. So, do you basically disagree with that? Or do you accept any of it? How do you explain his decision here? Because clearly what he's doing, according to your analysis, and I'm very convinced by it, what's going on is very, very immoral.
It is certainly immoral. And I think that Joe Biden, I think your language about is, do I agree with any of it? I do agree with some of it. I agree that Joe Biden believes himself to be, and probably is in some ways, a very moral man when it comes to people who are not Palestinian. Joe Biden, from what we know, became a staunch advocate for Zionism and for Israel at a very young age when he was a young senator, because he had very famously a meeting with Golda Meir, who charmed him, and he came away from that convinced that precious little Israel, this little democracy in the Middle East, was something that must be protected, and he wrapped it in amber and kept it that way for the last, whatever it's been, 60 years since that time, and that nothing can challenge that. Several people, including Ben Rhodes and others who worked in the Biden administration, and a couple who worked, and when Biden who worked in the Obama administration when Biden was vice president, have confirmed that in their view, Biden does not care as much about Palestinians as he does about other people. Because I think, I'm guessing, this is just a guess, that for him, because of the specialness of Israel, any people who are identified primarily in his world as being challengers to Israel, he's not going to like. So you see that, you saw it in every time that he said something about how terrible the conditions were in Gaza, and he's said it pretty frequently. It was always recited off of the teleprompter. It was in his notes. There was no passion. When he spoke of what happened after October 7th, it's an entirely different world. When he talks about the hostages, it's an entirely different world. There is passion. There is all those things. So is he compassionate? He talks a good talk. He says the right things. Does he believe it? I'm guessing he probably does, but it is profoundly not important. It is profoundly not important. Because when you're the president, what you personally believe or feel should not be allowed to be the basis for US foreign policy. So I don't know whether he's compassionate or anything else. And I don't think anyone of the Palestinians who are suffering under his policy care. That's the problem. It doesn't matter. Matters is what he does.
Thank you. Phyllis did talk about that. What do we do? Yeah. Virginia,
Oh,
right here.
I have a sort of a similar question, which is, oh yeah, I heard on Phyllis Bennis last night that the reason that Biden shifted his talk and is talking about a red line now is that he personally knew the chef from the World Serving Group, and he saw them working in Ukraine. And he was, because what happened to the service workers there was like to him an affront that he could identify it. And not, none of the Palestinians died or had surgery without anesthesia or in this place, but those 7 workers. And I'm wondering if strategically, like, we could position somebody who can speak to them on the thing that he cares about. And I agree with this, like, the president should be listening to the public, should be listening to other people, should be watching the polls, should not be going back for 100 armed deals since October 7th without even congressional approval. But I'm wondering if there is, like, strategically somebody, this chef who can go in and do anything to influence him.
The racism here is very strong, isn't it?
I'm really tired of hearing Biden say, I am heartbroken and I sympathize with those suffering. His actions are much stronger than his words. Literally within hours of the 7 humanitarian aid workers that were killed from World Central Kitchen, Biden sent a big shipment of arms and 2,000-pound bombs and aircrafts to Israel. So it's really unspeakable, and it's incomprehensible. I think that red line that you are talking about, it's because perhaps somebody in the Democratic Party and his administration, they're opening his eyes to the fact that he is not going to have a second term as president unless he puts more pressure on the Netanyahu government. And this is, nothing else has happened so far that will give me encouragement that he is going for a ceasefire. I remember during the 92 invasion of Lebanon, when Israel invaded Lebanon, Ronald Reagan at that time picked up the phone and called Menachem Begin and told them, enough is enough, stop. And then the Israelis stopped right away. So Biden can do the same. Biden has the power to do the same. He has the power to stop arms shipments to Israel, and he has the power to stop, not only military aid, but financial aid and diplomatic cover for the Israelis. So I have no hope there.
We're going to have to stop after the next question. Phyllis, go
Just
ahead.
quickly, I think that what Biden did was also profoundly racist. These were 6 people and 1 Palestinian. The 6 were all white Europeans and Australians. That's not accidental. That's not irrelevant to this. They are not just 7 more. There are 203 humanitarian workers who have been killed so far. These are the most recent 7. They weren't the first or the 10th or the 90th. They were the whatever. And that difference which is very much what we saw with Ukraine. There is a model there around the Ukrainian refugees who were being treated exactly as all refugees should be treated. The situation is not that the Ukrainian refugees should not have had access to hot soup at the border and care for their children and all that they got. It was that all refugees should have that. All people who have been slaughtered in Gaza should have brought him to tears. But it didn't happen until it was 6 white people from Europe and Australia and the US that hit him. And that speaks to his weakness of racism at the very personal. I'm not even talking about the systemic issues of what that means about coming from white colonial countries, because it's not really about them being white, it's from where they come from that makes them more important. So yes, they were treated exactly the way all these victims should. They're being profiled in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and PBS NewsHour, as they should be. They are heroes. And so are the other 203. That's the point. And that's what we don't hear from Biden or anybody else in the administration.
I'm not a Biden fan.
I don't know.
And this compassionate president of ours, you know, immediately cut off funds to UNRWA. And this is the largest humanitarian aid agency that has been providing, you know, for Palestinians.
We have one last question from Joe.
First of all, just to appreciate Myers' talk, and I'm hoping that it's available to all of us who heard it. And just to appreciate the eloquence of Michelle and all of his talk. Yeah, sure everything. I began working for Palestinian rights and against the occupation in 1975. And along the way, I interviewed a number of people, including Even, Omar, Sharon Water Minister, Yasser. What came through, among other things, and sort of been working on my life, and what came through was the profound, absolutely profound racism in Israel's society, which in anything is only done. And so I think we need to understand what's happening. Not only that Phyllis was talking about, as Michelle talked about, this the continuity of the past. This is the most extreme manifestation of racism, which is so deeply ingrained, unfortunately, in Israeli society. And talking about the World Central Kitchen people, those of us who are old enough to remember that this is essentially the same dynamic that played out in the 1960s when white folks joined Smith and went south. It was when white civil rights workers were killed that we got the civil rights act. So we need to understand this. So the point I want to make here, which is add to the discussion, has to do with how this war and the response of the West has helped in terrible ways. And also, I just want to say, as a Jew watching what's been happening, in many ways, it's like replay the war like hell, except we watch it in real time. And to understand what that means profoundly for the Jewish people, and this scar, this terrible now part of our history and world history, that we need to acknowledge this moving forward. Hard to talk about this again in context. But let me say that we need to understand part of the transformation run. Richard Falk has pointed this out really quite well. What we've seen is the myth, the rationale of rules-based order. What we see in the global South has been talking about it profoundly and consistently. We see it in the South African argument in the International Court of Justice. It's a sham. It doesn't count when, if you will, white folks, privileged people, are having that privilege challenged. And the reference, of course, to China, is today, next Wednesday, the 11th, we have a webinar actually with Chinese scholar from Hong Kong and American Chinese scholar talking precisely about how China has responded to the Gaza war and how it is dealing with opening that now come across the Arab world because of the United States policy has been actually. So I think it's just important for us to understand how profoundly this war is changing the world that we live in, the world that our children and grandchildren are inheriting, and our need to be standing up in any way we can for justice. That should be the lesson of all.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing? Thank you for that, Joe. And that is this question of hope. Unlike Israel, where the polls indicate that the youngest cohort is by far the most racist, the most anti-Arab. In this country, it's the young people who give me hope because they understand this issue as a racial justice issue that is intrinsically linked with the mobilizations of 2020 around George Floyd, around issues of police violence, around issues of racism across the board in ways that are profound and powerful. And I think for those of us, the majority of us here who come from another generation, this speaks to the challenge we have to make this kind of the legacy organizations of our peace movement relevant to young people. And part of it is understanding how they come to this movement. It is that of as an anti-racist movement as much as it is about international solidarity. So they have a huge amount to teach us.
Thank you. A good spot to end. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Hayat. We have so much to think about. We really appreciate it. What's next? Peter.
This one's about to run out of batteries.
Thanks, Rosemary. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you, all of you who came out in person to join us, and everyone online behind me and in cyberspace. I know one person who really wanted to be here, but she can't because she's in Cuba right now, our friend Miriam and Sarah. Yeah, it's right to applaud her, all the work that she's done. But the quote that she actually ends every email with it, but she says it quite often, I think is an appropriate transition into this part of the meeting. And that quote is that philosophers interpret the world, but the point is to change it. And that's what we are all about here at Massachusetts Peace Action. And forgive me, I forget who the original, Karl Marx. Hey, if Mary says it, it makes sense. I will repeat it.
Cal is a friend of Phyllis's. Yeah.
You get them later. But the great thing about Mass Peace Action to me is that the action is something that we take seriously. So one of the major things that we do is we take community education and we use it to spur action and political advocacy to make a tangible and real difference in foreign policy and to convince people that their views matter on something big, something global, something international that seems far away, seems like they can't change it. But our job is to convince the average person that their voice does matter and to give them the opportunity to get involved in a way that can make meaningful change. And so for the next little bit, Paul and I are going to talk about the things that we've been doing here at Massachusetts Peace Action and how you can get involved, what we've been doing, what we plan to do. And I will tell you that everything we're about to talk about was grassroots initiated. Everything, every working group and priority campaign that we are about to talk about came from our members, it came from our activists, it came from volunteers. So anybody who's hearing the sound of my voice right now, you're wondering if you can make a difference in the work that Mass Peace Action does. I'm about to give you a bunch of examples of how that happens. You can get involved, you can help us shape our agenda. I'll turn it over to Paul. You want to talk a little bit about priority campaigns?
Yes, so the issue is, how does mass peace action become more effective? We've been working on many issues over the years. We have a large number of working groups that are focused on very important issues in Latin America, and Haiti, and nuclear weapons, all kinds of really important issues. This past year, we decided that we had to become more effective, and we had to figure out how to devote resources to issues that strategically can change the world and that have to be addressed in a stronger way than we have in the past. The result is that we have a process of creating priority campaigns. And you're going to hear reports of these priority campaigns. We choose these priority campaigns from looking at the world, what's happening, and looking at the resources that MAPA has, and to figure out how to bring these together most effectively. Those working groups that I mentioned, that many of you are part of, will continue on. But now we want to bring about campaigns that can actually deal with the dynamics going on in the world today, whether it's the new Cold War with China and Russia. That was one of the stimulus for this process, and now facing the situation in the Middle East and Gaza. So we've developed 4 of these campaigns. We're going to very briefly explain these campaigns to you in the hope that you will get involved, as Brian said, in one way or another. These campaigns, you have the write-ups for these campaigns, the proposals for how they will operate this year, in the packet you received when you registered today. Maybe read them sometime. We are going to have some type of affirmation of these campaigns, but to make the process easier for you, we're now going to have reports from each of those 4 campaigns to give you a little bit of a sense, very briefly, about what their focus is, and I hope that you will see their importance. So I think, Brian, Can Do the first one?
This beautiful slideshow is done by.
Well, you'll find out that the interns, the new development this year, well, actually, the last couple of years, is the increasing role of interns from our colleges and universities in the greater Boston. With that said, let's turn this over to 2 of them right now.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Rowan Fortin. I am an intern from Northeastern University. And my name is Grace Sanford. I'm also a second-year interning at MAPA, also at Northeastern University. Yeah, so we're going to start today with our Can Do / Twin Threats campaign, which Can Do stands for Climate and Nuclear Disarmament United. So the fundamental goal of this priority campaign is to unite the climate and nuclear disarmament movement. And we have a couple of our methods of doing this. Our priority is to do educational strategies and action strategies. So we really based our entire campaign plan off of dividing it between these lines, between educating people on what we want to do, and then hopefully leading that to action. So for the education part, we're really focusing on establishing printed materials for our campaign, making flyers that we can hand out at standouts, whether that be at protests, whether it be at standouts at Harvard Square, etc., saying how both of these existential threats are connected and feed off each other. We want to increase our message on social media, really try to engage young people, especially. As college students, Ron and I are very passionate about getting more young people involved. They are passionate about the climate crisis, but really are unaware of how important combating nuclear disarmament is and how big of a threat that is to our Earth and to humanity. So that is another strategy that we're going to try to work on in this coming year. And also in the education part, we want to put on more webinars. It's another part of education, putting information out there, allowing people to come in, hear speakers, hear experts on these issues. Our action part, really attract, again, more public and media attention to our goals, for example, lions, rallies, and demonstrations. Slide. Sorry. So to achieve this, we have besides our fundamental goal, we have some medium-term goals and short-term goals. Like Grace said, for one of our medium-term action goals is to engage young people in the Can Do movement. One way we have done this, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is a webinar that we recently put on that was directed towards youth involvement, and we plan to do more, but that is currently where we're at with that. And an educational goal for our medium term is to really demonstrate how conflicts like Gaza and like Ukraine connects to climate and nuclear disarmament, and show really the importance of nuclear disarmament in these issues, and how it affects the environment of these places. For the short-term goals, we really want to promote the relevant state bills, which currently there are a couple that we're focusing on, the main ones being the nuclear commission bill, which would establish a nuclear commission of citizens that would look into how we are spending our funding on nuclear weaponry and potentially divesting that and that funding into green energies. And so we'll touch on that a little bit more, but that has been one of our main priorities. And the educational goal for short term is, once again, these are kind of similar, but really just connecting it to all the other campaigns and really showing how they all are interconnected. Sure, why not? So again, some of this kind of repeats, so we'll be really brief so we can continue with our conference today. But some tactics that we're going to use to achieve all of our goals through webinars, like we said, Ron and I co-hosted one about psychic numbing and turning our concern into action. Lobbying, we've had 3 lobby days on 2 bills to do with nuclear weapons manufacturing and climate change. So we've had 3 of those lobby days in the past 3 months. We basically live at the State House now, I think. Also, letter writing. We have been trying to continue to send out actions to all of our supporters so state representatives or even federal representatives can hear from their constituents on how they feel about these issues. And also an Earth Day action. This is something that we are currently in the works of planning. We are trying to co-sponsor an event put on by Extinction Rebellion, who is a very prominent climate group in and around Massachusetts. So hopefully that will be something that we will also be contributing to in the next coming month. Slide. That's right. Just a really quick recap of what we've done so far, what we can do. If you're interested about the bills, the House bill is H738. It has already been voted out of committee, and so it will be voted on the floor vote. I don't know when, hopefully soon. The other one, which is the Senate version, which is S1488, is due to be voted on by April 8th. So coming up here in a couple of days. Really hoping to keep pushing for that and making sure that they both get voted out of committee so that they can be fully voted on the floor. Like Grace said, we also put on a webinar about psychic numbing and action and how people can combat psychic numbing and what they can continue to do in their lives and how they can really get involved. And then collaboration, once again, we've also worked with Warheads to Windmills, which is a coalition that focuses on nuclear disarmament, Extinction Rebellion, Back from the Brink, and various student organizations, including some at Northeastern, some high school organizations, and some other college organizations. So we can really extend that outreach and get more youth involvement. Yeah. The only thing I'll say is if you want more information, pamphlets, actual things that you can read or sign up to join Can Do, we will have a table in the other room with all the information you could probably ever want. So thank you.
Okay, that's great. So we're going on to our second priority campaign called Ukraine, A Time for Peace. This is our beautiful banner over here that one of the interns put together for us. We use it at all our actions. Nuclear war, we've never been closer since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We live under this threat all the time. You've just heard about our Can Do campaign focused on this existential threat to us. One of the areas that are paramount in increasing this threat is the war in Ukraine. I know myself, for the first year of the war, I went to bed every night and got up in the morning not knowing whether I would find out that nuclear war had started that day. This danger continues. This year will be an incredibly important year regarding the Ukraine war. Unlike Gaza, there is much division within the peace movement about how we look upon this war. So MAPA has created a campaign that attempts to bring together people in the peace movement and outside who may have disagreements about the war, but who believe that this war must be brought to an end and must be brought to an end now. And that the strategy of this campaign is to bring those forces together in a call for a ceasefire and negotiations, and to break this pattern of just constantly sending weapons, escalation of the war, and all that. If you think that's a good idea, whatever you think about the war, we need you. Our goal, our strategy is to, we could put that one back on, to mobilize whatever resources we have in MAPA to give visibility and organization to what may be a growing sentiment in the US and internationally in favor of negotiations. To adjust the level of our activity, given the fact that Gaza is going to be the primary activity we engage in, but to adjust our level of activity to what is present, what is possible, I should say, at the present moment, and to be ready, to be organized for when this thing in Ukraine blows up this year, to bring maximum pressure to bear around a push for negotiations, as opposed to escalation. Okay, we can go into that. So this is the overarching strategy. I should say that in your packet, when you came in today, you have the full strategy proposals from each of these campaigns, which lays out this in much more detail, obviously. What are our goals? By the fall, to get either Markey or Warren to come out publicly in favor of ceasefire and negotiations. All of them are against it right now. All of them, every single Democrat, with the possible exception of Presley, is in favor of the continued escalation. We have to change their mind. That's a goal. One of them by the fall. Increase media and social media presence. You'll now see on the MAPA website, these 4 campaigns, including the Ukraine one, have their own web pages to give articles, discussions, webinars, whatever, on those issues. In addition, because of the interns, we're mobilized, we've developed social media campaigns to get the word out, supporting ceasefire and negotiations as a rational and compassionate approach to ending this war. Connect with any international campaigns, as we did this past year. We don't have time to go into it. To win over parts of the Gaza movement, who presently say nothing about Ukraine. To show them how significant this war is in terms of world peace, in terms of Ukraine itself and its very existence, in terms of a new relationship with Russia. Russia is not going to disappear. To teach people about the history of how this war got started in the first place. Never has an alternative narrative been blocked out in the media as it has on Ukraine. What we know about Ukraine has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth. And this is a very dangerous situation. So these are some of the goals. Do we have one more slide? Yeah. Tactics, public education. This Thursday, you have an opportunity to hear Chaz Freeman, former Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense, to speak about Ukraine. The title of the talk is The Lessons of the Endless War in Ukraine. This guy, if you have not heard him, will blow your mind. Listen Thursday to this webinar that we are putting on. In addition, we have our postcards. We go out, we've got well over 1,000 of these postcards signed. If you haven't signed one, we have a table out back. It'd be great to send it to Warren Markey asking for a ceasefire in negotiations. So we do public actions constantly. Stabilize the campaign. Our focus right now, before the Ukraine issue blows up completely, is to build our organization, to build our organizing committee, and especially to build our support group through the webinars, through the postcarding, through the public actions, through the social media stuff, to get people to say, I want to be part of your campaign. If any of you are willing to say that, we need you. And we will let you know what's going on, and you can plug it into it. You are going to be very much needed as time goes on. The protests, we're trying to build on the idea of ceasefire in Ukraine. A lot of people are thinking that a ceasefire in Gaza is a very important issue. Even though the politics of this are completely different, a ceasefire is also a solution in Ukraine, and we hope to ally with people working on Gaza who see it that way to have a 2 ceasefires campaign as the year goes on. And we had a wonderful demonstration on February 24th, downtown, in which we brought the Gaza ceasefire and the Ukraine ceasefire together with lots of music. It was a terrific event. And to meet constantly with Warren and Markey's office to see if we can bring them along. Not to change their whole idea of everything about Russia, that they hate, all this type of stuff, but to show them that the only way to end this war in a way that does not endanger the whole world more than it does right now is through ceasefire and negotiations. So I hope you will consider joining us. We have a table in the other room. If you have time to come by, all kinds of material, please sign the postcard and especially sign up for the campaign. Thank you. And next we have Mary Ellen to talk about the most important campaign right now.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, this is definitely quite a vibrant campaign. Here we go. So, oops. The context of this campaign is that certainly since I've been doing this, and not quite as long as many here, started really in the 90s, I haven't seen anything like this. Certainly Iraq was widespread, but this has a dynamism that is really moving it forward and keeping it sustained. It connects strongly to different movements, and that's what we're seeing with especially young people and other constituencies. It connects with issues of racism and settler colonialism and oppression, and people are getting it. The other thing about the campaign that the context is that for many people, the mask is finally off. All these pretensions of the United States and the rule of law and upholding humanitarian rights. People are really seeing through it, although of course it's not everyone quite yet. And to also acknowledge that this upsurge is really, as Phyllis said earlier, is really the culmination of so much work over the years. I remember seeing Norm Finkelstein years ago at Brandeis, and he was jeered, and there were people, throngs of people booing him. Of course, he was able to keep it together, but the way things have changed, so that we have more grassroots understanding of what the context is, it's really to the credit of people like him and certainly JVP. And bottom line is we have no half measures that we are going to tolerate. There's just no compromise with genocide. Next slide. So the goals, well, these are just a few goals. So just to cover, some, of course, ceasefire now, but that's not the end story. That's not the end goal. We are very much concentrated on focusing get people understand that it is the purse strings, the support for Israel by the US to stop that military aid, and which is going to be really, really hard, but to make people understand, make that connection with people. And also the issue of UNRWA. I mean, I learned from Phyllis that this is the only agency that is charged with implementing the right of return. So it is also the only agency that is the institution that's able to do to give people the sustenance, the infrastructure, the care, the education that they have all these years. And our aim is to do our best to ensure that it is restored by the US and to support in any way we can. Certainly, what's been on my mind of late, given the escalations and the fact that now Israel is bombing, every country in the region, from Iraq to Syria, and now with the consulate of Iran, we have escalated, and I think we need to focus on trying to prevent, tamp down that escalation in any way we can, and prevent it from really blowing up into a wider regional war. So anyhow, of course, we also need to focus on this narrative, this idea that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are somehow equivalent, and that is another challenge. Next slide. As far as political goals, I've skipped there. So one issue is certainly to make it an election issue, and it's happened already. Certainly the No Preference campaign was remarkable, and it swept the country. It's happening everywhere from Hawaii to Rhode Island the other day, that in fact voted 15% for their, I forget the term that they use, but the equivalent of no preference, and pressuring Congress. This is sort of at the heart of what a lot of us do, since we have district teams for each of the 9 districts. And this kind of pressure has to happen in many flavors, many different tactics that I'll discuss later. We want to endorse candidates who stand with our policy, and currently Ayanna has been very, very good. Of course, we need to make sure that she maintains her strength, given all the pressures on her. But there's a wide range. I guess she's at the corner end, really, and she stands out, but there's quite a range, certainly from someone like Jake Auchincloss, who is my representative and is immobile and is not just an anti-Zionist, but a staunch militarist and imperialist. Connecting the Palestine-Israel movement to other peace issues. Again, this is happening organically, so we don't need to try to figure out who we need to connect with. They're there. The work is, half the work is in many respects done for us. And also we need to call for a negotiated political situation where everybody has equal rights, regardless of religion or nationality. Also a tall order. Next slide. So our organizational goals are already underway. We have committees in each of the 9 districts. We have sub-teams that are working on different aspects of our work. So we have a webinar team, and of course we've got the wonderful work in great part spearheaded by our wonderful interns on social media and also our communications team. We have a steering committee that is, slowly emerging. A lot of the people who joined this Gaza campaign, they're really new to activism. It's really wonderful to see. So a steering committee of sorts is formed, the leadership committee, and they're still getting their bearings, but we're doing some wonderful work and having some wonderful actions. I think another really important part of all of this is because of all this new blood that has emerged and become part of Mass Peace Action, we're building a core of activists who have developing deep understanding of the issues. And we're also, as is presented here, strengthening coalition relationships all over the place. And we're also involved with collaborating with folks in Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. So we featured Mazen Kunsea, who is he is the founder of Palestine Biodiversity and Sustainability Institute. We featured an Israeli high school teacher who's been silenced, a Knesset member in our webinars. So we actually have some really great, exciting collaborations that are developing. Next slide. As far as tactics, again, just a short list. We are certainly lobbying Congress, and we're doing this in different ways. We're in person, we're doing daily phone calls in coordination with a Muslim-led initiative, an Arab-American-led initiative that is reminding people daily to contact and call these district offices. There are rallies, there are online advocacy, sort of the bread and butter of Mass Peace Action as well, webinars, social media campaigns. But in particular, we are interested in primary challenges wherever possible. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. And we also, next slide, our sectors for outreach. Again, a lot of this work is not so much work because there's people, these little bundles of energy have just sprung up like mushrooms all over the place. So it's actually wonderfully challenging to be able to know that there are groups and little communities. And Newton has a group of concerned parents who by themselves have organized and trying to pressure Jake Auchincloss, for example. So there's a lot of potential there, and it's encouraging to be able to spot things and to connect with people and build the work. And in particular, of course, we have faith groups who are already involved and political groups. I think the trickiest thing is going to be the last one there, the liberals and progressive accept Palestine folks. And that's actually what I'm dealing with in my community. A lot of, burners and folks who are, on board with Medicare for all and whatnot. But as far as Gaza is concerned, kind of not in their, under their radar somehow. So that's going to be the most challenging, but it's certainly something to look forward to, convincing people. Thanks. So the last thing I want to leave with you is that we have this coming week rallies at a bunch of congressional offices. I think people are organizing, and perhaps we'll have rallies in all 9 districts, hopefully. And this is the 3rd round of monthly protests, and it's very inspiring. It's when we can all sort of work together and join voices and actually show our members of Congress that we're actually building momentum. We're not just sort of hanging back. So this third round, we're actually going to have a unified message for all of the members of Congress with our demands. And then, of course, Peace Action National is organizing a wonderful grassroots lobby day. It's a coalition of, I think, more than 40 organizations that is led. And people are going to go down to DC. You can sign up. There's an online sign up, and I think it's in your packet. But there's also the possibility of participating online if you can't make it to DC. And finally, Emmett Yao. So I mentioned that we're really interested in people who might challenge folks in Congress. So Emmett is a very interesting, young, newly minted lawyer. He's an anti-genocide candidate who is hoping to challenge Catherine Clark. And MAPA right now is in the process of figuring out whether to endorse him or not. We've had meetings, and it's going to climb up the ladder and ultimately get to the board for a decision. But the main point is that he definitely is very enthusiastic, wants to do this, and he's collecting signatures. And Sonia is here. She actually if you're in CD5, she has the petitions for you to sign on and make sure that Emmett can get on the ballot. And they need 2,000 signatures make that 4,000, right? You always have to double the number. They need the signatures by May 5. So anybody here who is in that district, please find her so that you can sign on to that. And other than that, I hope that I communicated that it's a very vibrant campaign. And even though we often meet every week and there's like 20, sometimes 30 people in this meeting thinking, out loud what to do, we definitely need more energy, all of your energy. This is I think this is one of the turning points in the peace movement and maybe, for humanity, period. So thank you. And I guess I'm going to give it to the next person.
No.
Not now.
You're up next. Thank you. What's the next slide after this? Okay. Hi, everybody. Again, thank you so much for showing up. So this component of our priority campaigns is a little different than the others. All the others are about the leading edge of the battle. We are about peeling the potatoes to make sure that the movement can be fed. And we focus on the cost of Americans of an excessive, outrageous Pentagon budget. Now, unfortunately, we have this situation that the number of Americans who know that more than half, it's on, that more than half of the income taxes that you
Try the other ones. Yeah, shut that one.
okay. Hello.
This is switch. There we go. Maybe we'll turn this
All
off
right.
and let it rest.
That more than half of the income tax dollars that you sent to Washington goes to war preparations and nuclear weapons. If people knew that, right, they'd have a different attitude towards towards our policies. They don't know that. I know. I go around and give talks. I showed this slide that shows where taxes go, and people get up and say, "I don't believe that. I'm a professor in political science. If that was true, I would know." So I'm sorry, but that's the case. No agency of the federal government, not since the institution of the income tax, has ever communicated back to taxpayers where your money is spent. Right? You've got to be a genius to find that out on part of a campaign where you research it. So for many Americans, the crisis is right here. They can't afford health care. They're afraid of being kicked out of their apartment, right? They are in a crisis. The crisis is not in the future. The crisis is now. around healthcare. Tens of thousands of people in Massachusetts died of COVID that didn't have to die, and we've been properly invested. But despite all of the high level of organization of the healthcare system, nobody in the healthcare system said, well, one of the reasons we weren't prepared for COVID-19 is we were spending all this money on the war machine. And so we formed, Catherine, why don't you come up here? So some years back, we formed a Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare mini campaign. We gathered together people who were already leaders on the healthcare front. They've been fighting for Medicare for all, single payer, but they recognized this other component. And Catherine Delory, who's one of those people, will tell you a little bit about our Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare campaign. Some of it's up there.
Sure, I have to step back. Thank you. Fund Healthcare Warfare is looking at our healthcare system and issues of healthcare relating to various constituencies within our society, and looking at how the money that we spend on militarism is influencing the kind of healthcare that we get. And I just must say that I'll tell you what we've been doing, but one of the very exciting things for me is that every time we do a webinar, every time we do a talk, whenever we've also spoken at major conferences like American Public Health Association, every time we do that, people come up to us and say, wow, I never made that connection before. And so that is very, very exciting, because we're not just trying to enable people to see the things, but we're raising their consciousness to various kinds of things. Now, we are a working group, and we are collaborating with a lot of organizations like the Mass Nurses Association, which is very, very strong, Massachusetts Public Health Association, and other smaller groups, not only locally, but throughout the country. Yes, we already said that, I said that. And we have our webinars. We've focused a lot of our webinars on women's health. We call it Seeking Women's Health Justice. And then we talk about various issues. So we've had a whole webinar on incarcerated women and how we don't have the right resources, not only because they're incarcerated, but the kind of health care they get. We've had it on substance abuse. Interestingly, our last webinar was Women at the Crossroads, and we talked about nuclear war and warfare and how that influences it. And one of the interesting resources, or one of the interesting speakers we had, was talking about financialization of women's health, how we're getting all these webs and digital programs and so forth. And I can't believe how opportunistic we were on this, because about a week after we had that webinar, President Biden and his wife, Jill Biden, pronounced that they were having this wonderful health campaign, and they made it sound like it was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I was a little concerned, and I said, wait a minute, I don't think this is going to be as good as it could be, since especially when they came to Boston to announce it, and pardon me if I say anything about MIT, they announced it at MIT Biomedical department. Oh, that's very good. I mean, I come from a public health background, so anything like that, I say, wait a minute, let's look at the preventive part of it. And right after that, there have been all of these emails, and their campaigns are starting and everything, because what they are pointing out, this has nothing, as far as you and I are concerned, this has nothing to do with health. It's all about financing healthcare, getting more money and getting it into the pockets of the people that are making the profits. So that's just one of the things what I think is interesting. We have another webinar coming up, which I think many of you would be interested in, on the steward healthcare issue. Some of you may be aware of what's been going on with that, and that'll be in the next couple of weeks or so. And then the week before Memorial Day, we are having a women's health justice webinar on women veterans and the kind of health care that they have to see. So I guess we certainly, the working committee is looking forward to having many of you join us. If you'd like to, just contact Jonathan or myself. And we look forward to doing more webinars in the future and educating people. And after each webinar, we have a resource page on these various topics. So if any of you are interested in those resource pages, just let us know. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have developed a certain culture or tactic. We go to people and we invite them. We say, we have a big membership, thousands of well-meaning people, but they don't know anything about health, healthcare, or being a nurse or public health. Would you come and tell them about what you're doing in your struggle? And then we just make sure that whoever is chairing the meeting, like Catherine and me, slips in a slide about where the tax money is going, just in the background. All right, so that's ongoing. We can continue. It's a very, very lively working group, meets monthly. The second fund, which we're opening up, is public schools and public education. The slogans would be kind of books, not bombs, invest in minds, not missiles. Now, in public education, you know, those struggles, hundreds of years, right? Mass Teachers Association, 110,000 teachers already organized. American Federation Teacher Masters was 26,000 school teachers already organized, fighting on these fronts for years and years. Unfortunately, parents are organized. There are no statewide organizations of parents. What there are is local groups, because historically public education was financed locally by property taxes. And most parents, and in fact many teachers, believe that most public education is financed locally by property taxes and state taxes, 75%. They just leave out the fact that a quarter of the state budget for public education comes from the federal budget. It is completely invisible, right? You can go to meeting after meeting after meeting, as I've done because my son was running for school committee, and nobody ever mentions the federal component of it. If you remind them, Title I, that's a federal program, Pell Grants, that's a federal program. If you remind them, right, then you get it. So we have a lot of work to do. We want to get these organizations like the Mass Teachers Association to recognize if they really want to finance decent public education in Massachusetts, they have to, oppose the draining of money into the Pentagon budget. Now that means starting where they are, which is not the Pentagon budget. Well, we have a slide about the. So here is a conference that's coming up a week from today, organized by Mass Peace Action. Some of the educators are kind of quizzical. What are you doing organizing such a conference? I tell them, well, if you organize it, I would have gone, but you didn't organize it, so we organized it. So more teaching, less testing. It's about the fact that one of the attacks on public education is the imposition by the hedge fund managers of these high-stakes tests as a way of controlling curriculum and dumbing down, reducing the quality of education. And that's a leading edge of the fight. Mass Teachers Association has collected 100,000 signatures and tried to get a referendum on the ballot. And Congressman Bowman from New York has introduced legislation into the US Congress opposing this. So we're putting on a conference with leaders in public education talking about this. But in that conference, our own rep, Carol Doherty, will be talking about the federal budget and getting in that books, not bombs. And we hope to kind of add that component to the mix. But even if we fail, we'll have the list of all the people who attended the conference, and we will invite them to join a Books Not Bombs working group to carry this forward. Did I get the job with this slide?
I think no, this was it.
Okay, so one of the things we need to do is so, because we're far behind, we need some basic literature. Oops. Hello. We need some basic literature that we can go to a teachers' convention and put out on the table that shows that a significant amount of tax dollars that should be going to education is going to nuclear weapons and Gaza and Ukraine. And so one of our projects is to produce this basic literature to make it available. And we have some templates because decades ago, Carol Doherty, now state rep, was the president of the Mass Teachers Association. And we had a Books Not Bombs campaign, and they financed the printing and circulation of some dynamite leaflets to their members. And then that disappeared kind of when the Cold War ended. And we want to return to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. So next, we want to talk about our working groups. We have, what, 9 or 10 working groups that are up and running that focus on all of our different issue areas. But before we get into those, I want to say a brief word about something that sits sort of between a campaign and a work. And that is the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign, which is actually a coalition that we are involved in. If you look to that side of the room, because there's no slide on this, but as many of you know, Raytheon up until recently was headquartered right here in Massachusetts. We scared them out of here. They moved down to Virginia, actually to be closer to and all the rest of them. But Raytheon, second largest weapons maker in the world, making a lot of the bombs that are being dropped on Gaza right now. And they're also the third largest private employer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the entire concept of this campaign is to think globally, but to act locally against the military-industrial complex in our own backyard. And I don't want to go on too long because we have a lot to talk about, but this started with the war in Yemen. Major suppliers, arms suppliers to Saudi Arabia, and the bombs dropping on Yemen and causing famine there. But we have since transitioned, we're focusing a lot on Gaza now. And one of the tactics that we have found especially useful is notice that these big weapons companies really want to be seen as progressive. They sponsor a lot of progressive efforts. Like the Girl Scouts, like having a float in the Pride Parade. Just this past Wednesday, they sponsored a women's inclusive leadership conference at Syracuse University, and we were there to protest that action. You see that, well, the signs that we used. And it was incredibly effective. We reached the attendees and we started a conversation. Because most people attending an inclusive leadership conference are not likely to support the second largest weapons maker in the world, even if they are sponsoring that very conference. So we're going to keep that effort up. We're going to keep working with students on various campuses and make Raytheon realize that campus is not a safe place for them. And another thing that we have been doing is focusing on Raytheon's role in manufacturing nuclear weapons. And with that, I'm going to transition to our nuclear disarmament campaign. And I believe Susan Murphy is going to come up and speak to that. As I said, just as you come on up, Raytheon is not only making bombs that are dropping on Gaza, they're also a major manufacturer of nuclear weapons. So I'll pass it on to my friend Susan.
You bet. Thank you. So I'm going to make this really short, no pun intended. You know, we've been sitting for a long time, I realize. So if you want to just stretch and wiggle a little bit, it'll help you wake up and get a little warmer. Okay, glasses. So, the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group looks at all aspects of nuclear weapons, and we see connections with all other areas of work, of MAPA's work. Nuclear weapons don't make us safe. More weapons, faster, more powerful weapons being used intentionally or by accident. A member in our group says that their use is not a matter of if, but when. And we know deterrence is a dangerous myth. We look at nuclear modernization of the nuclear triad, 1.7 trillion over the next 30 years. Jonathan King and Richard Prushnick's article in Truth Out about Biden's funding of these weapons, you can find that on the table outside. Raytheon Nuclear Weapons Campaign looks at the corporations that make the weapons. We look at legislation regarding nuclear weapons, nationally HR 77, encompassing the TPNW and Back from the Brink. On the state level, Warheads to Windmills Commission Bill, divestment from nuclear weapons, and the taxpayer's right to know. Locally, Back from the Brink and the ICANN Pledge, which is the TPNW. Flashpoints internationally, nuclear buildups, US, Russia, China. The use of threat to use nuclear weapons as a political tool, widening wars, Gaza, Ukraine, Taiwan. We have outreach and subgroups. The Public Engagement and Movement Building Group did a training on how to be a speaker for nuclear disarmament. They brought the Golden Rule to Boston. They did flyers, the good news, bad news, and Be Their Voice out on the table. We have a missile defense, really missile offense group. We have a group addressing the dangers and cost of ICBMs. Look for a webinar in June. And we have a new film group. We'll continue to work on addressing the dangers of nuclear power here, decommissioning of Pilgrim, and abroad, Zaporizhia. We joined with the Indigenous Solidarity Action Group to address affected communities in the Southwest, but the movie Oppenheimer didn't show. All of that and more, thanks to the engagement of our members.
Thanks, Steve. We'll go to the next slide for me. And I think Peace and Climate, you're actually up next, Rowan.
Yes, so Peace and Climate is our group that focuses obviously on the climate. We mostly do a I don't know.
Oh, wow. I thought you were taking this. Yeah, our Peace and Climate group exists to connect these key issues. Jonathan, you were talking about how not too many people know how much money they are spending every year on the Pentagon. Not too many people know that the largest single emitter of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, the biggest polluting institution on the planet Earth, is the US military. Yes, you know this. But if you ask the next person you meet on the street who the biggest polluter is in the world, they're probably not going to say the US military. So it's incredibly important for us to spread this information, to make it common knowledge, and to combat this idea that we can green our military as well. That's an idea that's been coming out of a lot lately. But let's be clear, a worldwide empire of over 800 military bases around the world cannot be green. These ideas are incompatible. You choose one or you choose the other. So I know we want to keep moving. We want to get you into breakouts so that you can do some of the talking instead of listening. We appreciate your attention. But just to say, we are actively trying to work with climate groups, any climate group that we can, to platform them so they can talk about what's important to them, to our membership, and so that they can listen and learn about these connections between climate change, collusion and militarism, because these issues are entwined. They are, you can't solve one without the other. But let's keep moving. Rosemary, want to tell them a little bit about our racial justice and indigenous solidarity work?
Great, thank you, Brian. I'll start with the Indigenous Solidarity half of our working group. The IS Action Group had a book study this year of the book Our Beloved Kin by Lisa Brooks. It details an Indigenous perspective of King Philip's War, which provides a foundation for understanding the genocide and erasure attempts right here in Massachusetts a couple centuries ago. The Indigenous Solidarity Group continues working for passage of the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. There are 5 bills at the State House right now. Some of them you've probably heard about, such as having Indigenous Peoples Day on October the 12th. And there are regular visits to the State House and calls and emails to try to push those, to get our committees at the State House to push the work forward. Members of the IS group participated this year in the annual Indigenous Peoples Day March, festivities at the Newton Indigenous Peoples Day event, the Nolambeka Project annual Pocumtuck Homelands Festival in August, and the National Day of Mourning in November. And Mass Peace Action folks outside of the IS group also participated then. Recently, the IS group organized the webinar Oppenheimer, Sins of Omission, which highlighted the struggle of Indigenous people in New Mexico against the development of nuclear weapons and power. The action group also supported and endorsed the Native Land Reparation Pledge as a way for our members to participate in the Indigenous Land Back campaign. If you'd like to know more about that, just contact our working group. The racial justice half of the group meets monthly. Each of the groups meet monthly. We're working on 3 main campaigns. Number 1, the prison moratorium construction campaign. We're supporting legislative work and grassroots actions led by Families for Justice as Healing and the National Council. Claire Gosselin is our main contact with that campaign, and it's very active right now. In the last legislative session, both the House and the Senate at the State House passed this legislation. Then Governor Baker at the last minute vetoed it, and there wasn't enough time for the legislature to take a vote to overcome his veto. So now all the work is going on again, and if any of you have done advocacy at the State House, you know what hard work it can be to move bills forward. Our second campaign is supporting the New Democracy Coalition's work to change the name of Faneuil Hall and its demand for reparations for the descendants of formerly enslaved African people here. And we have a newly formed People's Reparation Commission that we're working with. Our third major campaign is demilitarizing our society. We're exposing and informing students, high school students and others, of their rights and alternatives to joining the military. Some of our schools, as you may know, have junior ROTC programs in the high schools, and students are being taught by retired military officers who are not credentialed as teachers. And our next step in this campaign is that we're going to meet with the Boston School Committee to see what they can tell us about that. Racial justice members have also organized webinars and written articles for the Peace Advocate, our newsletter. And we're currently following the Stop Cop City campaign in Atlanta, Georgia, and planning an article on this new chapter of policing as a tool of government and corporations working together to suppress dissent throughout the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. I will just say a few words about our Latin Caribbean working group. We know that the United States has not been a good neighbor to Latin American countries for now over 200 years. I believe it's 2023 was the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, which is oftentimes loved in school as Latin America from European countries, but as we all know, we were reserving the right to meddle in Latin American countries to the United States. We do this through sanctions, we do this through direct interventions and coups, we do it through the drug war, we do it by sending guns made right here in the United States, right here in England, flooding the streets of Latin America with American guns. And there's a direct relationship between American guns going to countries like Mexico and the murder rates skyrocketing as a result. And this connects to the problem of immigration, of people fleeing violence and seeking asylum in the US. It's often treated as a domestic issue. We know that it is by definition an international issue. It's an issue of war and peace. And folks who are hating, who are traveling sometimes thousands of miles and leaving everything behind, are not doing it on a lark. They're doing it because they're running from violence that often originates right here. So we try to connect these issues, and we're also, one of the things that's our group of Latin Americans are doing is our work on Cuba. We have held regular standouts on this. Of course, we know that undermining and trying to overthrow the government of Cuba has been a major priority since the revolution of the late 50s. So we do regular standouts, we've done educational events, we did a series of webinars from Havana, and we have also done legislative work on this. We partnered with Congressman Jim Government and Congresswoman Diana Presley to sponsor a letter that we got 7 members of the Massachusetts congressional delegation, including both of our senators, to send a letter to President Biden saying what it is. We promised we were going to restore the Obama policy that was incredibly popular, that Trump overturned. Get moving on this. Take Cuba off of the state sponsor terror list, which is hurting Cuban people and has nothing to do with reality. So we're going to continue to work on Latin America, on Cuba, on stopping sanctions in Venezuela, on Central America and the connection between U.S. imperialism and the violence in Central America. So if you are interested in working on one of these issues right here in the Western Hemisphere, consider joining our Latin America and Caribbean group. What's next?
I don't know if someone's speaking to Korea.
Paul. Do you have a few? Oh, yeah, Cole. Come on up. You both more comments.
What do you know about the webinar?
New England Korea Peace Campaign isn't a working group of MAPA, but it's a group that we are in coalition with and help to sustain. It's women-led, led by Korean Americans as part of the National Korea Peace Now grassroots network. And it basically lobbies for a policy change for reconciliation for the U.S. to stop impeding reconciliation between North and South Korea. As you know, the Korean frontier continues to be extremely tense in the context of the new Cold War with China. The U.S. is continuing to militarize South Korea as part of that whole strategy. The group also puts on a webinar series. The next one, I think, is the 24th of this month or something. It's that week anyway, to look at the South Korean election. They do have a general election coming up in the next week. And so we'll analyze that election result in the context of the regional tensions.
What's up next?
Thank you.
Okay, so let's bring, Hayat, could you explain the breakouts for someone? Okay, you can explain them, Brian, that's fine.
Yeah, enough talking from us. We want to hear from you. So we're going to separate into breakout groups that are going to review 4 important questions. You should have. Yeah, I think the, oh, it wasn't. Where is it? Yeah, well, Roman's gonna go get our breakup topics, and one thing that we all agreed was that instead of choosing them, we are going to break up into random groups. Because then maybe we'll be confronted with an issue that we don't work on every day, and hopefully we'll be with new people. This can be a little awkward sometimes, but we're trying specifically to start conversations and to get people a little bit out of their comfort zones.
So they're supposed to count off. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So, you heard that, maybe you didn't speak on the phone, but we are going to count off. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, Jane, I guess we'll start with you. You're not saying, okay, sure, we're gonna be 1. 1. Oh, you're facilitating. So, Peter? Sure. Denise? Rosemary? Okay, Virginia? Rashid? 1.
4. 2.
Oh, 1. 1. I won't stop me.